So there's this viral video making a pretty huge claim that the recent Bihar election was maybe the most unfair in all of Indian history. In this explainer, we're going to break down the case that video presents, piece by piece, and look at the evidence it uses to make such an extraordinary allegation.
And the video kicks off with it's a bombshell of a statement, right? It claims the election was just filled with unprecedented manipulation. This is the big accusation that sets the stage for everything we're about to go through. Okay, so before we dive in, I want to be super clear about what we're doing here. Our job in this explainer is to walk you through the arguments and the evidence as they are presented in the source video. We're here to report on the case it makes, not to say whether it's right or wrong. So here's how we're going to break this down, kind of like a case file. First, we'll look at the accusation itself. Then we'll dig into the three big pillars of evidence the source talks about: money, voters, and the system itself. And we'll wrap up with the video's final, pretty stark warning. All right, let's get right into the thick of it. The video doesn't just throw out a vague claim of unfairness. No, it lays out a very specific set of points that it argues are proof of a manipulated election. So the whole argument really rests on these 6 main points. It alleges a whole range of things, from direct cash payments to voters and illegal transportation, all the way to erasing evidence and a deep-seated bias within the Election Commission itself. We're going to explore all of these as we go. Okay, first up, the money. The source kicks things off by arguing that a massive government scheme was timed and executed in a way that, in its view, was basically legalized bribery. You know, the first thing the video points to is just the sheer scale of the money here. It highlights a government scheme where 12.5 million women each got 10,000 rupees right before people went to vote. The video then claims that a promise of another 200,000 rupees was dangled as leverage, which could have totally influenced their vote. And according to the source, the timing of all this is absolutely critical. See, the Model Code of Conduct, those are the rules that stop the ruling party from using government goodies to get votes, was already in place. But the video alleges these payments went out on multiple dates after that code was supposed to have kicked in. Now, to back this up, the video points out what seems like a major inconsistency. It brings up past elections where the Election Commission, the EC, put a stop to very similar payment schemes. So the big question the source poses is, why was the scheme in Bihar given a green light when all these others were halted? All right, let's move on to the second big piece of evidence, and this is all about the voters themselves. The video raises some really serious questions about the voter list and even how people were getting to the polling stations. The video cites some investigative work that claims the final voter list was just, well, a mess. The source says that not only were over 1 million suspected duplicate voters still on the rolls, but a staggering 8 million people who should have been able to vote were apparently missing. And it alleges the EC didn't even use its own software designed to clean up these very issues. And it gets even more specific. The video makes a really pointed claim about who was actually taken off these lists. It cites a report from The Wire, arguing that the whole process of deleting voters hit the Muslim community way harder than anyone else. I mean, they're about 17% of the population, but allegedly made up 33% of the names that got deleted. Then the focus shifts to how voters got to the polls. The source video plays news clips, and in one from ABP News, you hear a voter on a special train to Bihar say straight up that a political party paid for their ticket so they could go and vote. So, you might be asking, why is that such a big deal? Well, it's because there's a law for this. The Representation of the People Act, which is basically the rule book for Indian elections, is crystal clear. A candidate paying to bus voters in is defined as a corrupt practice. The source argues these special trains were a direct violation of that law. And that brings us to the third and final pillar of the argument, which is all about the system itself. The source alleges that the actual rules of the game were changed, and that key institutions just weren't being neutral. So the video asks a pretty simple question. If you wanted to make sure nobody could prove any funny business happened at a polling booth, like duplicate voting, what's the one thing you'd want to get rid of? The proof, right? And that proof would be the CCTV footage. And this is where it gets really interesting. The video lays out what it claims was a major rule change. It used to be that this footage was considered part of the official election papers, so you could request it. But then, the law was apparently amended to exclude CCTV footage, and a new rule was added to delete all of it after just 45 days. The source argues this basically destroys the evidence. Then the video kind of zooms out. It looks at how the referees of the game, the election commissioners, are even chosen in the first place. It points out that the Supreme Court created a neutral panel for this, but then the government passed a new law that replaced the impartial chief justice on that panel with a government minister, essentially giving the ruling party control over the selection. So after laying out all of this evidence, the money, the voters, the system, the video starts to wrap things up with a pretty stark conclusion about what this all means for democracy. The argument here is that this wasn't just one thing going wrong. It was a breakdown across the board. The video claims the Election Commission wasn't impartial, the courts were too slow to act, and the media just wasn't digging into any of it. Essentially, there were no checks and balances left. And this quote really gets to the heart of the video's final takeaway. The point isn't that one party or another should have won. Instead, the claim is that the whole process was so tangled up with these alleged manipulations that figuring out what would have happened in a truly fair election is, well, it's just impossible. So the final warning is this. The source is basically saying that elections are at risk of becoming less about what people want, things like schools and jobs, and more about who's better at gaming the system through these technical tricks. And that's the case as presented in the source video. It leaves all of us with a really big question to think about. When the very institutions that are supposed to guarantee fair elections have their trustworthiness questioned, what's left to protect the integrity of a democracy?